Good day. Today is Saturday, 21st June 2025, and as you can see, I am not in my own room. The reason, straightforwardly, is that there has been a complete internet collapse, not just in the area of my house, but in a substantial area in northwest London. My service provider tells me that it is what's called a mass outage of service. It affects all service providers, all internet provided by all service providers in this area, in my area. This kind of problem is becoming increasingly common, at least in London. I've had several internet interruptions, and that has meant that in order to make today's program, I've had to relocate to the home of a friend who has very generously given up a space in order to enable me to make this program to you today. So I'm told that this problem will have been resolved by tonight. I sincerely hope so. I should say that it's already been about 20 hours that I have been without internet in my own home, but hopefully as of tomorrow this problem will be solved. Anyway, there we go. Let's move on and discuss the pressing situations of today. And I think the first thing to say is that over the last couple of hours, a number of statements have been made by various Israeli officials, which appear to show that they have now come to understand that the initial attack, the one that was carried out on the night of Thursday, the 12th of June, and over the course of Friday, the 13th of June, though it undoubtedly did great damage to Iran and killed many senior Iranian military officers, was not the knockout blow that perhaps the Israelis had hoped, and that Israel is now looking at a long war. And, well, I've been discussing this for some time. We've discussed this on a number of programs on the Duran as well, Alex Christoforou and I. And this is now starting to become a consensus. There are still a few people who believe that Israel has Iran on the ropes. But on the contrary, the reports that I'm hearing speak of a somewhat different story of Iranian defenses gradually becoming more organized, of Iran being more successful shooting down Iranian drones. I completely discount their claims, by the way, that they shot down F-35 fighter jets. I've seen no evidence provided by Iran, no convincing evidence that that did indeed happen. If that evidence exists and they produce it, I will of course revise my views. But anyway, gradually, slowly, Iran's air defense system seems to be coming back into operation across more and more of the country, and the Iranian political leadership seems to have reorganized and stabilized, and Iran continues its missile launches against Israel. And I've seen a report which says that Prime Minister Netanyahu now claims that Iran has a stockpile of around 22,000 ballistic missiles that it is able to launch against Israel. That is far more than some of the earlier figures that were circulating around, I seem to remember, 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. It was claimed at one point that Iran was burning through its stockpile very fast, that it would be Israel that would win any endurance race. That doesn't seem to be what the Israelis are saying anymore, assuming, of course, that Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments on this point were actually true. Now, earlier in the combat, in the fighting, there were reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu had visited Greece. Again, there's so much false information circulating that I've wondered whether or not that was really even the case. But I understand that he did in fact go to Greece. He didn't go to Greece in order to conceal himself from the Iranians. He went to Greece for one other specific purpose, which was to get the Greek government to agree to host Israeli aircraft, Israeli fighter jets, in case Iranian retaliation apparently became too dangerous for the Israelis, for the Israeli Air Force on their bases. Now that was in the first hours of the war, which shows that the Israelis did have some doubts about the overall success of the operation, even as they were launching it. And I wonder whether now, given the change of the situation, the fact that the Iranians are indeed hitting Israeli targets, whether in fact some of those Israeli fighter jets are indeed being relocated to bases in Cyprus and Greece. Well, I'm not going to dwell on this. I don't know. Maybe others have more information about this kind of thing than I do. Anyway, this is the overall military situation. Israel is able to continue to attack targets in Iran. It is able still and has continued to strike at Iranian nuclear facilities. Esfahan came under particular attack a few hours ago. But the general consensus is that Israel's ability to attack these Iranian nuclear sites is only denting them. It is not able to destroy them. It is not able to destroy Iran's entire nuclear enrichment program. Now, I say that the Israelis have been making statements about this over the last couple of hours. There's been claims from Israel that Israel has pushed Iran back 3 years in its development of a nuclear weapon. Now, all I would say about that is that this does not seem to be corroborated by information about the actual damage done to Iranian nuclear facilities on the ground. Information that the IAEA and its director, Rafael Grossi, have also been providing. But this figure, this timeline of 3 years before Iran could acquire a nuclear weapon corresponds exactly with the claims made by Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, providing the joint finding of the US intelligence community to Congress back in March. At that time, Tulsi Gabbard and US intelligence was saying that it would take Iran roughly 3 years to develop a nuclear weapon if Iran actually were to make the decision to do that. And here we now see Israel or Israeli officials apparently telling the media that after the Israeli attacks, it would take the Iranians 3 years to acquire a nuclear weapon. I wonder whether this is a coincidence and whether the Israelis, who cannot want to find themselves in a prolonged war of attrition against Iran, whether they are now providing this information in order to basically synchronize their position, their timeline, with that of the US intelligence community. Of course, they will continue to insist that Iran was on the eve of acquiring a nuclear weapon capability before Israel attacked. But now, having launched their attack, they're saying that it will take 3 years for the Iranians to acquire nuclear weapons, and that, and I don't believe it's a coincidence, is the exact time frame that the Americans also are saying. Now, I wonder whether that suggests some kind of debate going on between the Israelis and the Americans, with the Israelis finally, in a kind of face-saving way, coming round to the American point of view. It could be. Of course, we don't know. I'm sure that discussions take place between the Israelis and the Americans all the time. But as I said, we don't know. And if that is correct, if the Israelis have, in this way, basically accepted the American timeline, then that might possibly be a sign that the US government is indeed now trying to find a way out of this crisis by negotiations and perhaps through a ceasefire, and that the Israelis, under American pressure, have given the United States the means to do that, the excuse, if you prefer, to do that. All of this is highly speculative. It is extremely tentative. One shouldn't place any reliance upon these speculations of mine at all. Now, having said that, the president himself, Donald Trump, has been speaking. It seems that the meeting between the Europeans and the Iranians in Geneva was a complete failure. It only lasted 90 minutes. The Europeans came along and repeated to the Iranians the American demand, Donald Trump's demand, that Iran stop enriching uranium entirely, that it accept zero enrichment, that it import, in other words, all its enriched uranium from abroad, a proposal which the Iranians have categorically rejected in the past and which they will continue to reject, I am sure, in the future. It's extraordinary how Western governments, when they find a formula which they agree with each other, Eve Smith's famous observation of, I think it was 2 years ago, that the Western powers spend all their time negotiating with each other before they put a proposal to the other side, ignoring the fact that it is the other side that must decide whether or not to agree with the proposal. Anyway, it looks as if the Europeans and the Americans have been in negotiations with each other, that they've come round to this zero enrichment formula, completely ignoring the fact that the Iranians have already rejected it and will continue to reject it in the future. If the Europeans and the Americans stick to this position, then I predict that we are indeed in a long war. Now, can I say Iran has good grounds, excellent grounds in fact, to reject this proposal? Firstly, enriching uranium is something that Iran has a right to do under the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which say that every country has a right to develop nuclear energy unimpeded, provided it is done for peaceful purposes. You could put a question mark around Iran's decision to enrich uranium to a level of 60%, as I do, but there can be no doubt at all about Iran's right to enrich uranium to a level of 3.6 or 7%, which is what they were doing in the past and which is consistent with a civilian, peaceful nuclear program. Insisting that Iran give up that right would be to demand of Iran that it failed to exercise rights that every other country in the world that is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as Iran itself is, that every other country in the world has. So I cannot imagine that the Iranians would agree to that. It would be an astonishing act of discrimination against them, and it would be a massive violation of their sovereign rights as a nation, something that they are extremely sensitive about and which they are determined to uphold. But beyond that, there is another reason, a more practical reason, why I am sure that the Iranians will reject this proposal. And that is that in the past, it seems that Iran did not have a uranium enrichment program, and that the reason it decided to start enriching uranium itself was because it was being prevented from importing enriched uranium from abroad. It had made deals with various countries, including Argentina, to import enriched uranium, and it discovered that the Western powers took steps on every occasion to prevent the enriched uranium that Iran was contracting to buy ever reached Iran. In effect, if Iran were to give up its right to enrich uranium, it's quite likely that its entire nuclear program would come to a stop, at least as far as the Western powers are concerned. They would do everything within their power to prevent Iran acquiring enriched uranium. The Iranians could, of course, continue to import enriched uranium from Russia and North Korea and China and those sort of countries. But again, from an Iranian point of view, that would make Iran dependent on the goodwill of those countries if Iran were to run a nuclear program. That goodwill has not always been there. In the past, Russia and China have supported sanctions against Iran. I can understand again why Iran might not be willing, even though it is now a member of the BRICS, to agree to such a demand, placing itself in a position of dependence on its Eurasian friends. Just saying. So, unsurprisingly, when the Europeans made that demand, Mr. Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, said no, and the entire Geneva meeting collapsed after 90 minutes. But it is perhaps the response of the President of the United States which was most interesting, because Donald Trump, after that failure of that meeting in Geneva, said that clearly what the Iranians want to do is to have discussions not with the Europeans but with the United States, and he seemed to suggest that he's open to those sort of discussions, and he also seemed to suggest that he is open to the idea of a ceasefire. He is, however, and it must be said also, still making very, very aggressive statements about Iran. And if the Iranians believe that this is necessarily, that these more conciliatory comments from Donald Trump are a conclusive sign that the United States has given up ideas of attacking Iran, of joining the Israeli operation, then I would say that they're being dangerously complacent and exceedingly unwise. And for the record, I don't think the Iranians are going to make that kind of mistake. Briefly, we have to look at what is actually happening on the ground and in the sea. The United States has withdrawn all its aircraft from its forward bases located in the Gulf. It appears, however, to be concentrating huge forces at some of its bases further away in Saudi Arabia. They might not be further away from some of the Iranian missiles, just saying, but anyway, that is where very, very large quantities of aircraft and other material from the United States is now concentrating. And perhaps from an Iranian point of view, more alarming of all, We're getting reports now that up to 3 US Navy carriers are being deployed to the region. That is practically, as I understand it, the entire operational American carrier fleet. The United States has 11 nuclear carriers, but only some of these are ready and operational at any one point in time. I'm told that the surge rate of US Navy carriers is currently 4, and 3 out of those 4 are now being positioned in the seas around Iran. We have the Carl Vinson, which is in the Arabian Sea. We have the USS Nimitz, which is steaming from the Straits of Malacca towards Iran, and which will soon be able to join the Carl Vinson on station. And we have the more modern carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, which is apparently now in the Western Mediterranean. It's entering the Mediterranean. This was apparently a long-scheduled deployment. The United States pretty much always has a Navy carrier in the Mediterranean. It has done so throughout my lifetime. But of course, a US Navy carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean is in a position to provide military support to other Navy carriers conducting strikes against Iran from the Arabian Sea. So this enormous deployment of forces does not suggest to me peaceful intentions towards Iran by the United States, nor are there any confirmed reports of meetings so far between Iranian and American officials. There have been claims that Steve Witkoff and Abbas Araghchi are in regular telephone contact. I would love to believe that that is true, but there is no official confirmation of all of this. And besides, the Iranian position continues to be that they are not prepared to enter into formal negotiations or discussions with the United States whilst Iran is being attacked by Israel with the assistance of the United States. Now, that could be a negotiating position. It may be that that will change, but that is the Iranian position for the moment. So there it is. I think that we have, for the moment, a stalemate and a standoff. But I still myself think that there is a very, very high chance, indeed, that we could find ourselves in a situation over the next couple of days when the United States does finally join the attack against Iran. On this issue, again, I would refer to Naked Capitalism. I mentioned Eve Smith before. She's done another very fine article, in my opinion, in which she makes, I think, the compelling point that regardless of the political risks domestically for Donald Trump in joining the Israelis to conduct a strike against Iran, the political risks to Donald Trump of not carrying out such a strike are also high and not to be underestimated. And having gone as far as he has done, it is going to be extremely difficult for Donald Trump now to pull back, assuming he even wants to. There is a factor here, by the way, which I've not discussed in previous programs, but which is important and which must not be underestimated. And that is the deep unpopularity of Iran with many, many people in the United States, including Donald Trump himself. I get the very strong impression that Donald Trump has no time for the government, the regime in Iran at all. He's obviously old enough to remember the US embassy hostage siege of 1979, 1980, and the humiliation of the United States at that time. I think that he has never liked Iran, and I think his dislike of Iran is shared by most American officials in his government and by a large proportion of a large number of people in the United States taken as a whole. For the record, since Tulsi Gabbard is often being spoken about, and there is a very concerning article on CNN which says that Tulsi Gabbard has lost Donald Trump's confidence. I hope that isn't true, by the way. So far, she's shown great courage and integrity in her position as Director of National Intelligence. And as far as I can see, she's fully competent to exercise that job well. Anyway, for the record, since we're talking, there's been a lot being said about Tulsi Gabbard over the last few weeks. I have always got the impression that Tulsi Gabbard doesn't like Iran either, or at least the government and the political system there. She is no fan of the political system in Iran. However, she does seem to have done that thing which other American officials with these very strong visceral feelings don't seem to be able to do, which is that she's been able to separate her strong feelings against Iran from the actual intelligence and factual realities. She acknowledges that Iran is not on the brink of acquiring a nuclear weapon, is not at present an imminent danger to the United States or even to Israel, come to that, or at least it wasn't before the attack on the 13th of June. And she also understands, or appears to understand, that whatever her personal feelings about the government in Iran, it is not the United States' business to overthrow it, and attempting to do so would create a massive crisis for the United States in the Middle East, or potentially could create a massive crisis for the United States in the Middle East, with no clear plan of what exactly it is that the United States is seeking to achieve in the Middle East with Iran if the Iranians stick by their positions. I'm going to finish by saying that, of course, Israel continues to hit at Iran. I'm getting the sense, but incidentally, that the Israelis are increasingly hitting the same targets again and again, targets that they can reach, perhaps rather more than the new targets that they need to aim at. They still try and occasionally succeed to assassinate Iranian officials, but the flood of Iranian officials that were being killed on Friday the 13th has now slowed to a trickle. And as the Iranians gradually sort their security systems out, almost certainly in this, I'm guessing, getting help from their Russian and Chinese friends, that trickle will probably stop completely, just to say. But of course, the Iranians, for their part, continue to launch their strikes against Israel. It's no longer hundreds of missiles at one and the same time. It's usually 15 to 20 missiles, sometimes a few more. Not all of the missiles get through. The Israelis do shoot down several missiles amongst the missiles that are launched at them every night. But some do get through, and there is clear film and photographic evidence, despite the Israeli censorship, that these missiles do damage. And the key and most important thing is that every Iranian missile and every Iranian drone that is launched at Israel poses the Israelis the choice. Do they try to shoot it down, in which case they are expending air defense interceptors, which multiple reports say are now starting to be in short supply? Do they, in other words, husband their air defense interceptors? Or do they try to shoot the missiles down? The cost being that if they don't shoot the missiles down or the drones down, then the missiles and the drones will hit targets in Israel, and that will damage Israel and deplete its capabilities, though in a different way. To repeat again, we are in a war of attrition. Each side has to be careful not to exhaust its resources too fast. If what Prime Minister Netanyahu is alleged to have said is true, then the Iranians have greater resources to bring to bear than the Israelis do. And that, of course, is what decides a war of attrition in the end. Now, yesterday I discussed my dismay that there are now speculations about using nuclear weapons to destroy the enrichment plant in Fordow. I believe that is the correct way to pronounce it, by the way, Fordow. Just saying. This has been apparently discussed extensively by many people. Let me repeat again my absolute dismay and horror at this. I've read that the nuclear weapon that would be used to destroy the Fordow facility would have to have a power of around 300 kilotons, more than the nuclear devices that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I cannot understand how people can even be contemplating that idea, given that both Israel and the United States now apparently agree that Iran is 3 years from developing a nuclear bomb. Just saying. But it still shocks me that these discussions are even taking place. And to repeat again, they do set in particular context all of those endless stories, fables as I believe, that the Russians had been intending to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine in the autumn of 2022, and that the United States was so alarmed about that they contacted the Chinese to get the Russians to stop. Apparently, stories like this, we're supposed to be frightened and alarmed about, but murdering the political and religious leader of Iran and debating whether to attack Fordow with nuclear weapons is something that we're able to do. And, well, it's par for the course. I hope we completely put aside these very, very dangerous ideas. On this topic of the attack on Fordow, incidentally, I noticed that the British columnist Max Hastings, who has considerable contacts within the British military, has expressed his own doubts about whether the conventional bunker-busting bombs that we have been hearing so much about that the United States possesses, of which apparently it has a total stockpile of no more than 20. Anyway, Max Hastings, also doubts that these bombs would work successfully and would really be able to destroy the facilities in Fordow if they are as deep below the mountain and as hardened and as well protected as some are saying. Well, again, it seems to me that there are no good military options. I don't think that the United States is itself actually in any good position to wage a long attrition war, anywhere in the world, in fact, including against Iran. That's not to deny that Iran would suffer huge damage if it found itself in a conflict with the United States. But as Professor John Mearsheimer correctly said in a live stream that we did with him yesterday on the Duran, you can find it on the Duran site now, there is no recorded case of a regime collapsing following a bombing campaign. Actual fighting on the ground is necessary. That was true, by the way, in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi. There were relatively few NATO troops on the ground in Libya, but there was, of course, a force of Libyan dissidents or mercenaries or whatever you want to call them, who were, of course, fighting the Libyan army. There is no recorded case of a government in secure control of a country collapsing as a result of a bombing campaign. Saddam Hussein's government didn't do that in Iraq. The North Vietnamese government didn't do that either. It didn't happen to them either. The German and Japanese governments did not collapse during the Second World War, despite massive bombing campaigns. Maybe Iran would be the exception, but it would be the first instance where that had ever happened. And of course, if the political system in Iran does not collapse under the weight of a bombing campaign, history teaches that the political system starts to adapt, it starts to strengthen, it starts to attract support to itself, and of course, in the case of Iran, it will be able to start winning ever greater amounts of economic and potentially other help and aid from its allies, its friends, China and Russia. Now, this is where I'm going to finish today's program on the topic of Iran, but I'm now going to talk about Ukraine. Before I do, I'm going to say that the Russians are in the process at the moment of conducting their major economic conference, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. I've attended it twice, by the way, in 2014 and 2016, but I've not been invited since, and I've not gone. I was, of course, there recently for the legal forum. All sorts of very important people were at SPIEF this year. The president of Indonesia, the high representatives from South Africa, a prominent and important official from China, a member of the Politburo, who had a one-to-one meeting with Vladimir Putin, just saying. A very senior representative from the Kingdom of Bahrain, who is, amongst other things I noticed, the commander of the Royal Bodyguard. So there were all sorts of prominent visitors. Obviously, the most senior was the president of Indonesia. Indonesia having just joined BRICS and being potentially one of the great powers of the future. Anyway, this was an important meeting. Vladimir Putin had an awful lot to say about the economic situation in Russia, which I will revert to in future programs. He talked at very great length about the fact that any claims that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country, that it is simply a supplier of raw materials, especially energy products, that bears no relation to reality anymore. He's right, by the way. I will, as I said, discuss this in more detail in future programs. He also made it very, very clear that under no circumstances should monetary policy in Russia be so tight that it results in a recession. He firmly expects, in other words, that the central bank will be bringing down interest rates sooner rather than later. Anyway, he had an awful lot to say about all of that. But of course, he did talk about the situation in the Middle East, and of course, he also talked about the situation with respect to Ukraine. And the situation in the Middle East is what I'm going to quickly touch on. What Putin, over the course of the plenary session at SPIEF, had to say about that. And again, he made it absolutely clear that Russia fully backs and supports Iran, that Russia sees Iran as a victim of aggression, that the Russians strongly oppose the Israeli attack on Iran. He walked back ideas that Russia might act as a mediator between Iran and Israel. He'd floated that possibility in conversations with Pezeshkian and Netanyahu, and in conversation with the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Trump seemed open to the idea, but the Israelis and the Iranians were not. The Israelis apparently rejected it outright. But Putin again spoke about ideas that the Russians have been presenting to the Israelis and to the Iranians in order to try to bring this conflict to an end. A conflict in which, as I said, he's made absolutely clear that Russia is taking Iran's side. Now, as to what those ideas are, Putin didn't spell them out, but it's not difficult. As I understand it, the ideas essentially are that Iran hand over its enriched uranium above 3.6% to Russia. This happened previously with the JCPOA, but I understand that this time there would be a provision that if sanctions were not lifted, then Iran would be able to get the enriched uranium back. One of Iran's permanent grievances is that they expected, when they agreed to the JCPOA in 2015, that the country would get not just significant sanctions relief, but that the sanctions would steadily be lifted. And that never happened. And the Iranians have always felt that they were tricked and deceived by the United States and indeed the Europeans over that. Well, this time, the Iranians would say that, yes, they will agree as before to hand over their enriched uranium to Russia. But if on this occasion the Americans and the Europeans fail to act on their promises, then Iran would have a right to have its nuclear enriched uranium back again. So apparently that has been discussed. It has also been discussed that Iran would be able to continue to enrich uranium up to a level of 3.6 or 3.7%. But with the important qualifier, with the suggestion that the enrichment should take place as part of a consortium, an international consortium operating the facility, the enrichment facility, with the United States conceivably even having a role in it. The only absolute condition that the Iranians insist on is that the enrichment facility, the relevant enrichment facility, be located on Iranian territory. So these proposals have been floating around for some time. The Russians have been involved in formulating them. I'm sure the Russians are offering further safeguards to the Israelis to ensure that this happens. If this a deal is put in place, that it happens. Probably the Russians are communicating the same ideas to the Americans. And as for the Iranians, I'm going to suggest that the Russians, and probably the Chinese too, are also telling the Iranians that if all of this takes place, if this deal is done, then the Iranians really do need to sign a defense pact with Russia, the one that the Russians offered, to start receiving military equipment from Russia on a regular basis, let the Russians build up Iran's air defenses. I read a report, well, it wasn't a report, I received information some time ago that the Russians had proposed to Iran that Iran's air defense system be reorganized in a comprehensive way and be plugged into the Russian air defense system, which would enable the Iranians to receive data directly from Russian satellites and radar systems. In other words, enormously enhancing Iran's ability to track and monitor missile launches across the Middle East. And of course, the Iranians could receive other weapons from Russia, advanced fighter jets, the Sukhoi 35s, and things of that kind. So there is the makings of a deal there, one which would give guarantees that Iran would not be able to develop nuclear weapons. The Russians emphatically do not want that to happen. And that's not even a question that's open to discussion. Putin reiterated that, by the way, over the course of the plenary session at SPIEF. And anyway, as I said, there is a deal. It was on the table before the 12th of June. It is on the table now. It could probably be revived. The Iranians would probably accept it, despite the deep anger that continues to exist in Iran. Pezeshkian undoubtedly would support it. There would be others within the Iranian system that might be unhappy about aspects of it. But I think that as part of a comprehensive deal, the Iranians would probably come round. The question is whether the Israelis and the Americans are interested in a deal like this, and that remains to be seen. The options, as far as I can see, are not good. If the Americans and the Israelis refuse this deal, well, we are now clearly in an open-ended war of attrition, and despite the enormous damage they can do to Iran, that's not, it seems to me, a winning or safe proposition for the United States. Anyway, let me now turn to the question of Ukraine, because Vladimir Putin said quite a lot about Ukraine as well. He was asked questions about this, and as invariably happens, he said certain things which admittedly are pretty hardline and need to be taken very seriously, but which perhaps when you read the totality of his comments are not quite as extreme and as hardline as some reporting suggested. First of all, he did say, as we shall see, that as far as he's concerned, as far as Russia is concerned, Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. And in that respect, all of Ukraine is ours, Russia's. So no part of Ukraine is being invaded by Russia because Ukraine is itself anyway, properly speaking, a part of Russia. And he did also say that there is a long-standing trope in Russia, which is true, by the way, I've heard it said previously, that where the Russian soldier places his foot, that is, from that moment on, Russian land. The Russians do not withdraw from territory they occupy. He did say that. As it happens, anybody familiar with Russian history, Russian and Soviet history, knows that that is far from the truth, that the Russians often withdraw from territory they occupy. They've done that on many occasions quite willingly. They've not been forced or pressed to do it. There is no reason to think or believe that if there wasn't a deal done, they wouldn't do it with respect to Ukraine. But anyway, when you read, as I said, the totality of Putin's comments about Ukraine, they do turn out to be rather more moderate than some of these rather tough quotes would suggest. Anyway, this is what he said. I'm taking this from the Kremlin website. It's more my translation, a combination of the machine translation and my own. The Kremlin has not yet, as at the time of making of this program, provided its own translation, but I'm confident that this is correct. And he said this: "We have been told since the early 90s and for decades that under no circumstances, never, under no circumstances, would NATO expand to the east. Since then, we have had 5 waves of expansion, one could say 6. Despite all our calls not to do this, all our calls have been ignored. That is one." Now, by the way, Putin is absolutely right about this. You still get people in the West who heroically, or perhaps I should correctly say desperately, insist that the Russians were never told in the 1980s and 1990s that NATO would not expand eastward. The overwhelming weight of the evidence, and by the way, my own recollections about this, confirm the opposite. I should say that I can clearly remember the then German Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, going on British television at this precise time and saying that the Russians had no reason to worry about the reunification of Germany because there was no possibility, none at all, ever, that NATO would expand further east. I remember him saying that. Obviously, I don't remember his exact words, but I remember that very same television interview, which has probably now disappeared into a memory hole somewhere. Anyway, Putin goes on to say this. These are, of course, the rudiments of the old, if not ancient, colonial policy, modernized to a certain extent for modern realities. These are actions from a position of strength, neglecting the interests of Russia. As for Ukraine, this is also an action from a position of strength. Everything that happened there, what do I mean? This is a state unconstitutional coup in Ukraine. That also was a product of position of strength policies. The previous US administration admitted that it had spent billions of dollars on this coup without embarrassment. They said this publicly. Our actions were always aimed at protecting a part of the population that considered itself spiritually and through blood ties connected to Russia, to Russian culture and its people, meaning the people who live in Crimea. When our attempts to regulate the situation in the southeast of Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk were made, these were also part of those attempts. Again, acting from a position of strength, our ideological opponents, we might say, tried to resolve this issue again by armed force, launching military actions against Donetsk, Lugansk, in Donbass. It was not we who launched military actions. And after the coup was carried out, and part of the population of Ukraine in the southeast of the country did not recognize the results of the coup and did not recognize the power of the conspirators and the persons who had carried out the coup, it was then that military actions began being launched against them. We tried to reach an agreement peacefully to glue the situation together, but our partners, we'll call them that in quotes now, that's the word partners. It turned out later they started peace talks with only one purpose: to pump Ukraine with weapons and to continue the military actions. He is, of course, here referring to the February 2015 Minsk agreement. This forced us to recognize the independence of these republics, Lugansk and Donetsk. We did not recognize them for 8 years and tried to reach an agreement. but we were forced to recognize their independence and to start providing them with support, including armed support, in order to put an end to the war unleashed against them by our opponents in the West, who now rely on extreme nationalists in Ukraine to fulfill their objectives. Everything that is connected with what is happening, with the tragedy that is happening in Ukraine, is not the result of our work. It is the result of those who do not want to put up with the global changes that are happening in the world. And then he was asked, but you talk about Donbass, but the Russian army is now advancing beyond Donbass. They're advancing into Kharkiv region and into Dnipro region. They have even marched beyond Zaporozhye and Kherson regions as well. And this is where Putin made the comments that have attracted so much attention. You spoke about the regions in Ukraine that we consider ours. I have said many times that I consider the Russian and Ukrainian people to be one people in reality. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. People omit the words "in this sense," but Putin is saying, look, you can't call this a foreign invasion of a country. This is a battle fought out between two sundered branches of what are the same people. And anyway, he then proceeds. We proceed from the realities that are taking shape. Of course, there are people, and there are many of them, in the neighboring country, and here he means Ukraine, who strive to ensure their sovereignty, independence. Well, God bless them. By the way, we have never questioned their right, the right of the Ukrainian people to independence and sovereignty. The grounds on which Ukraine became independent and sovereign were set out in the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine of 1991, where it is clearly written in black and white that Ukraine is a non-aligned, non-nuclear, neutral state. It would be good to return to these fundamental values on which Ukraine gained its independence and sovereignty. From the very beginning, when the conflict had already acquired an acute character, we proposed to the then Ukrainian leadership to immediately stop all conflicts, to withdraw their troops from those territories where people do not want to live as part of Ukraine, where anti-state and anti-constitutional coups are taking place, but want to live either independently or as part of the Russian state. They refused. That is interesting, and I wonder what Putin is referring to. Were these discussions maybe that took place in 2014? Did the Russians float with the Ukrainians the possibility even then that Ukraine might withdraw from Donbass? Just saying. Anyway, I'm not going to enter into that. But then he goes on to say that there are political decisions, but then there is also the logic of military operations, because military people look at where it is better. Where are the ravines, the mountains, the rivers, where it is better for troops to go in order to achieve the final result with the least losses. A certain logic of military operations occurs, and the troops end up in different territories. You know, this is where we have an old, I won't say it's a proverb, a parallel, a parable, an old rule, where the foot of a Russian soldier steps, that is ours. But then he immediately qualifies that. He says, I don't want to look so militaristic. In fact, at every stage of the events that were taking place, we suggested, I want to emphasize this. At every stage, what I'm going to say is the absolute genuine truth. We suggested that those with whom we were in contact with in Ukraine, stop. And we said to them, let's negotiate now, because this logic of developing purely military actions can lead to your situation getting worse, and then we will have to conduct our negotiations from other positions, from positions that are worse for you. This has happened several times. I will not go into details. And then there is a long discussion of Boris Johnson and the American government's sabotage of the April 2022 Istanbul Agreement, which I'm not going to go over. And there's also discussions about the irrationality of Ukraine's military strategies, the fact that Ukraine is desperately short of personnel, but through the Kursk operation, they themselves took the disastrous decision to overextend the front lines, and that they're still doing it, according to Putin. They're still conducting attacks in all sorts of places. They're overextending themselves. And anyway, there's a lot of discussion about that, but I'm not going to touch on any of that in this program. I'm also not going to touch on other things that Putin also said in these comments in this program, that they were very interesting. He talked, for example, about the inevitability of multipolarity, of the fact that economic and demographic trends made the change in the global system inevitable. Apparently, I haven't found this, by the way, in the Kremlin readout. He may have said it, and it might have been not reported. The Kremlin sometimes edits his words. But apparently he said that the change in the world that is taking place, irrespective of wars and military operations and geopolitical strategies, is as inevitable as the rising sun. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss that. Let's go back to what he said about Ukraine, because it is very interesting. As I said, his statements, his comments were more measured and less hardline than people perhaps think. But they still do represent a dramatic shift from positions that the Russians had earlier in the war. What Putin is now saying is this. Russia and Ukraine are severed branches of the same people. The Russians and the Ukrainians are ultimately the same people. They are both Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Slavs. They speak similar, if not identical, languages. And many people in Russia, anyway, by the way, assume that most Ukrainians most of the time speak Russian. And I've heard that this is the case. And I've also heard, incidentally, that after a major attempt, after the start of the conflict in 2022, to suppress the use of Russian in Ukraine, that Russian is coming back strongly and is once again becoming the main language of everyday conversation. I don't know about that. I've never been to Ukraine, but that's what I've heard. Anyway, this is Putin's view. It is also a very widespread view in Russia that Russians and Ukrainians are essentially the same people. So what Putin is saying is this. We've made various proposals to Ukraine. We've never up to this time challenged Ukraine's sovereignty. But Ukraine's sovereignty ultimately is conditional on what Ukraine itself agreed at the time when it became independent, which is that it should be neutral and non-aligned. It cannot be united against Russia with the West. That is something that Russia will not accept. And as for the territorial realities, because so far as Russia is concerned, all Ukrainians are Russians, and all Ukrainian territory is ultimately Russian territory, or if you prefer, part of the Russian world. The further west the Russian army goes, the less of Ukraine there will be, because any territory within Ukraine that the Russian army occupies is going to remain Russian. And that, to my mind, essentially says that even if there is a cessation of the fighting today, more likely than not, the Russians will insist the territories in Kharkiv region and Dnipropetrovsk region that the Russians currently control remain part of Russia as well. And Putin is also, in effect, signalling that if the situation continues and goes further, and the Russians start to gain control of more important territories in Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv region, and Sumy region as well, then ultimately all of those territories will become Russian too. Now, one of the most interesting exchanges that took place over the course of this discussion was that Putin was asked how big the buffer zone that the Russians are establishing in Sumy region is going to be. And he said 10 to 12 kilometers, but then he quickly said that though the Russians have not set themselves the objective to capture the city of Sumy yet, he is not excluding that possibility. I take that to mean that the Russians are actually considering capturing the city of Sumy. Now, we can go further from this because bear in mind what I've said in many programs previously, that Putin is always the more moderate voice within the Kremlin, within the Russian leadership, and he's always the one who measures and weighs his words most carefully, and it doesn't follow that ideas that he's proposing aren't going to be taken a lot further by other people within the Russian political, military and security leadership. I've noticed for some time that the Russian Defense Ministry has stopped mentioning Ukraine. They referred, for example, to the latest prisoner exchange. They referred to the fact that Russian soldiers, Russian prisoners of war, had been returned to Russia from territory controlled by the Kiev regime. In other words, no reference here to Ukraine as a state or country or nation. Ukraine has now simply become the territory controlled by the Kiev regime. And it's not difficult to put that together with the comments that Putin has made, all of Ukraine is ours, that some people in the Kremlin no longer recognize Ukraine's legitimacy as a state and nation, and are starting to see the outcome of the war as one in which Russia reacquires, reunites, conquers, annexes, use whatever word you wish, Ukraine, which reverts again to the position that it had after the 17th century, which is as a region of Russia. Now, as I said, I don't think this is yet Russian policy, but there was another discussion of the situation in Ukraine at the UN Security Council, I believe yesterday, and I noticed that Vasily Nebenzia, Russia's very formidable ambassador to the United Nations, came out and said that the memorandum that the Russians recently provided to the Ukrainians, which sets out Russia's terms, is Ukraine's last chance. That if the Ukrainians don't accept this memorandum, if they don't accept the proposals that are contained there, there might be some room for flexibility about the details, but the overall thrust of Russia's demands is non-negotiable. If the Ukrainians don't accept that, then the outcome will be capitulation of Ukraine. That is what the Russians will seek. And then following on from what Putin is saying, then in that case there will be no Ukraine. Now, Putin said all of these things at SPIEF. There were foreign visitors present. There was the president of Indonesia. There was the leader of there was a senior official from South Africa. There was a senior official from Bahrain. There was a member of the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo. And all of them were listening to these words. And not one of them, none of them came out and said, this is completely wrong. We hear what President Putin is saying, but we want to make it absolutely clear that we recognize Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and its right to exist as a nation. It could be that if Russia reabsorbs Ukraine in the way that Putin is now hinting, and others in Russia are basically already saying that it should, if Russia reabsorbs Ukraine, then obviously the Western powers, the Europeans, the Americans, will not accept it. We will see governments in exile and all that being set up in Europe and in the United States. But it could be that the response of the rest of the global South, of the global community, the global majority, the people whose rise Putin apparently said is as inevitable as the sunrise. Anyway, they will accept it, or at least if they oppose it, their opposition will be muted. Now, I think this is something that people in Kiev and in the West need to understand. Putin has not set out the boundaries. He has not said where, as far as he's concerned, if it comes to that, and the Russian army goes on advancing into Ukraine, he's not said where they would stop. But he is now talking for the first time in a way that could prepare the ground in the future for the disappearance of the state of Ukraine that we have known and seen for the last 30 years. It is now for the first time, or so it seems to me, a possible outcome of the war. It is not yet Putin's intention. It is not yet Russian policy. But if a settlement is not achieved within the next few months, it might become so. Now, let's look at whether Putin is able to translate all of this into fact. The short answer, as far as I'm concerned, is that he is. He again repeated his claim that the Ukrainian army is reduced to 47% strength, that the Ukrainian army is only hanging on by a thread. I discussed in my program yesterday information I obtained from a very reliable source about the fact that the Ukrainians are running into shortages of artillery barrels and artillery shells. I'd also mentioned that the German media has said that Ukraine is down to 120 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and that is nowhere near enough, and that there are no replacements in sight. I've now received more information about the drone situation. Ukraine is now obliged to build drones relying exclusively on Western components. And my correspondent said that the outcome, the final result of these drones, are drones which, in some respects, are still better than the Russian drones. They use more advanced materials and equipment, and drone for drone, they're probably still better than the Russian FPV drones. However, because Ukraine has to use Western components, each Ukrainian drone now costs multiples more to build than each equivalent Russian drone. And the difference is the difference in quality is so small that the higher quality of the Ukrainian drones cannot make up for the expense of building them. The Russians may have slightly less good drones, FPV drones, but they're able to mass produce them in their tens of thousands and can afford to do so because the costs are so much lower. And this is simply not the case with the Ukrainian drones. And this probably is another reason why we're seeing reports start to circulate now about the fact that Ukrainian frontline commanders are now starting to complain that they're not getting the numbers of drones that they hoped that they were receiving at the same time last year. It does look as if the cessation of Chinese drone supplies is having a critical effect on Ukraine's ability to maintain its drone wall. And, well, yesterday I talked about shells and tanks and armoured vehicles. I've also had information about the relative costs of mass producing weapons in Russia and in the West. Suffice to say that, again, this correspondent believes that Western analysts, even as they accept that it costs the Russians far less to produce weapons than it costs the West, are still underestimating how cheap it is for Russians to go on producing weapons. He gave me actual figures for what it would cost the Russians to produce from new a T-72 tank. And it is significantly below even Western estimates. And it is only a small fraction of what it would cost the West. This correspondent also pointed out that in addition to Russia's steel production, which is at various times either the second or third biggest, it's roughly on the same scale as the US and Japan's, or so I believe. It's less than India's and far below China's, but then everybody's steel production is far below China's. Anyway, even though the Russians nonetheless still do produce a lot of steel, one of the reasons they're able to produce weapons in the enormous quantities that they have is because there is so much steel, scrap metal steel, available in Russia. They have enormous stockpiles of this. And they've been drawing on these stockpiles of scrap metal. And this has also been playing a significant role in enabling them to keep control of the costs of production. And he also told me that the Russians are very, very careful to make sure that production cost doesn't spiral out of control. They have much tighter controls on spending than we see in the West. Well, that I have known for a long time. The same correspondent, by the way, said the same is true about Israel, that the Israelis, whatever the other problems that they may be having, do understand the importance of the cost factor in military procurement and are much better at controlling costs than other Western weapons producers are. And I suspect that, by the way, is true. Anyway, there it is. So the Russians can continue to produce weapons in enormous quantities, and they now have a decisive advantage in relation to drones. And we're getting more news from the battlefronts. Yesterday, the Russians conducted a massive strike against the industrial city of Kremenchuk on the Dnieper River. Again, it's difficult to say exactly what that strike was connected to, what it was doing, but there's suggestions that the Russians were destroying an oil refinery there, the oil refinery that provides fuel for some of the frontline forces that the Ukrainians have. There doesn't seem to have been much in the way of air defense in Kremenchuk, just saying. Meanwhile, there's been further reports of more Russian advances. The Russians have apparently captured an important village to the west of Kupiansk. It's been suggested that Kupiansk now is almost encircled and that its fall might be imminent. Again, I'm not able to discuss this. I'm not going to discuss in detail whether or not that might be true. I haven't had the time to bring myself up to date with all of that. There's been more Russian advances around Konstantinovka, and it does seem to me actually that speculation about Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka, south of the reservoir to the south of Konstantinovka, finding themselves encircled, have probably already come true. And this time there's supposed to be several thousand Ukrainian troops trapped there. Perhaps more dramatic still, and in complete conformity with an analysis that Big Serge has made, the Russians are now far to the north of Pokrovsk, northeast of Pokrovsk, and they seem to be advancing still in this direction against, as far as I can tell, very limited, fragmented Ukrainian resistance. It seems that they've now reached and are attacking a village called Koptyevo, which is well to the north of Pokrovsk. I can't help but think that another mass encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk is now at least threatened, if not yet fully underway. And well, there are more reports that the Russians are now preparing to attack a village called Novopavlivka in Dnipropetrovsk region. So the Russians do continue to advance, and in light of all of that, Putin's words must be taken very seriously. Well, this is where I finish today's program. We will see what happens over the next 24 hours, whether the Ukrainians take note of Putin's warnings or whether the Americans do, and what happens in the Middle East, whether, as many believe, the United States will attack Iran over the next couple of hours. We'll just have to wait and see. But this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where we are selling various items identified by cities. I already have my Durand London mug, for example. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.